So the next film we're going to review is Little Joe by Jessica Hausner, reviewed by Jim.
Well, a few of us have seen it, but I'll give a little introduction to the film to begin with. So this one premiered at Cannes earlier in the year. It's scheduled for release on February 21st, just shortly after we are broadcasting. It's basically a story about a genetically engineered plant, which is designed to make the people who breathe in its aroma, its pollen, happy. Now, it's basically kind of pitched as a horror film, but we'll get into that in a minute, and it's got some vaguely unique aspects to it. The main person we follow is played by Emily Beecham, who I believe won Best Actress at the Cannes Film Festival for this film. And she plays one of the scientists working in this lab that is developing this plant. Her colleague is played by Ben Whishaw. And basically she surreptitiously takes one of the plants home, kind of against protocol. And then at this point we start to notice some strange things happening to the people who have been exposed to the plant's pollen against kind of what was expected. And sinister goings on, and it's got a very creepy atmosphere. So the other people who've seen it here are Mark and Betty. Mark, I'll start off with you. What did you think of the film? It's quite an odd film, I would say. It's got a lot going on, but what did you take from it?
Yeah, it has an atmosphere of sorts, but it doesn't have as much atmosphere or as intense an atmosphere as I thought it was going to. And it starts by doing a lot of kind of ominous tracking shots, which don't communicate all that much to you beyond there's a large space here which they have to traverse, which is the little laboratory where they have the plants growing. And there's a bit of a funny thing where two separate species of plants are growing in the first little like industrial glass house that they have. But like the two different species of plants are next to each other, and one begins kind of releasing its pollen into the air and the other begins to die because of it. And you thought, just get two different glass houses for those different species. The cinematography is very interesting, as I mentioned, like those long and quite slow tracking shots, which there's an interesting variation in them when they start framing conversations, because the camera tends to just dolly forward in the space between two characters where they're talking, and it's almost as though it frames their conversation. So not what the characters are doing physically that's interesting in those scenes, it's literally just their words. And that sort of mirrors the fact that there's either a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist. I'm not quite sure on which Lindsay Duncan's character would identify as, but that this is a film sort of hinting towards psychoanalytical subtext which just becomes text at a certain point, is kind of reinforced by the way in which those conversations are centered over everything else in those frames.
Yeah, so you mentioned the fact that there's a psychoanalyst character, so there's quite a lot of layers going on here. Betty, what would you say was your biggest takeaway? What struck you about the film to begin with?
Well, my sort of experience of this film was extremely sort of inconclusive, in the sense that as a film, I wasn't especially impressed, but as a viewing experience, I thought it was pretty entertaining, whether intentionally or not, I don't know. But it's interesting that you should mention the premise of the film. I don't generally like analysis of films on this level, but if you really think about it, having a genetically engineered mood-enhancing plant, which needs to promote the production of oxytocin in your body in order for you to take care of it, is an incredibly high-maintenance product, considering what it's supposed to do. Alongside that, in terms of how it treats psychotherapy, I was sort of I wasn't really sure what to make of the ideas in this film. Do mood enhancing drugs make you a different person according to this film, or is this just a narrative device that doesn't necessarily need to be interpreted in any which way? Stylistically speaking, I don't know how to react to a lot of the choices made here. Probably the most amazing one is the kabuki music, which I thought was pretty interesting. I dare to say was even a pretty clever choice, given how sort of how much of a counterpoint it was to the aesthetic of the film. But also not really, because just like the aesthetic that the film was going for, traditional Japanese theater music is pretty minimalistic and austere in its sound. However, the rest of the aesthetic of the film's style was, I felt, somewhat inconsistent, starting with Emily Beecham's haircut, which was quite stylized, but then all of the other characters dressed pretty conventionally, for example. And scenes that were exterior shots were in no way indicative of the environment we were in, whereas the laboratory shots were all sort of dystopia light. However, all of that being said, I don't know if I can tell you not to watch it, because for all that it was trying to do as a sort of cerebral, chilling sci-fi film, I think it ended up crossing the line and going into a campy sort of sci-fi flick, like something, not to be too critical of it, but something that sort of seemed like a sci-fi B-movie from, say, the 70s or something like that.
It's interesting that both of you brought up basically stylistic elements, right? So there's the soundtrack, there's the production design in terms of kind of the character costumes, and then also the cinematography and the way the shots are made that Mark mentioned. Broadly speaking, I like this film. Like I had some fun with it, but it really to me lacked something to hook on to narratively or thematically. Now that's not to say that there's not things there. I think in terms of the way that you talk about kind of mind influencing drugs and maybe antidepressants and the effect that this plant has on people, I think the film is definitely trying to say things, but it's very focused on the style of it. The music, as you said, is, I mean, to me, is the dominant thing in the film, and that's not a bad thing. I liked it, and it suitably creeped me out way more than necessarily what was happening or what is on screen. But the thing that really stood out to me for this film was the not the production design, the sound design, right? Because even the Foley work, which is focusing on kind of like how the plants unfurl, like it's all very meticulously done, and I think it creates an atmosphere very well. The production design is also very particular. All the staff members in the lab, they're all wandering around with these like mint green lab coats on, and there's always a sense of foreboding generated with kind of like pink light in the growing area and also other spaces. In particular, Emily Beecham's house, when she takes the plant home, it kind of sits ominously on a pedestal underneath this sort of like quite warm-looking light, right? But the thing is, to me, there wasn't really a whole lot beyond that. Now, that's not to say it wasn't trying to do these things, but it just lacked a bit of punch. It lacked something for me to really hold on to, so I never really got drawn into it. I was more admiring its style throughout. Is that what you would say was your experience, or did you get more from it than perhaps I did?
Well, I think there's some pleasure to be had with the performances specifically, although I think I would probably agree with you that there's the style foregrounding the substance is probably a matter of it overpowering it. There's a I have to say that I did enjoy the dog. Once you see a dog in a laboratory, you know it's not going to end well, is it? And I do enjoy Ben Whishaw's performance particularly too, because he makes a very good counterpart with his performance in David Copperfield this year, where he's just playing an utter creep, kind of very sycophantic creep, and here he's doing a sort of, I think, well articulated variation of that. His character, I think called Chris, is just persistent and like just about to step over the line but never quite does. And Emily Beecham's the only person in the film who has a kind of like well-rounded line reading, a scheme for well-rounded line readings, whereas everybody else is not quite flat affect, which is the thing people usually say about Jessica Hausner's movies, is that they're all speaking in a monotone. It's not quite that. It's just that I don't know what you'd say. The intonations are just very strangely pitched.
So this is actually the first of Jessica Hausner's films I've seen. How does it compare to her other work?
Yeah, interesting. The only two I've seen are Lourdes and Amour Fou. Amour Fou I think is fantastic, and that's the film where she kind of skewers German romanticism, or a particular idea of German romanticism, and costume dramas seem to work for her brilliantly, as evidenced by that film. But Lourdes has a kind of just overly wry mocking sensibility, I think.
So, Betty, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
I actually agree that the performances were probably one of my favorite bits of the film, and a lot of the lines were delivered in a way that, like Mark said, weren't necessarily flat. They were just vaguely inappropriate for what was being said, but in a way that in a way that ultimately entertained me, in a way that I found charming. And I felt like Emily Beecham was the only one whose sort of effective performance made sense all of the time, in the sense of a very, I suppose, chilly and cold performance, but not to the degree that it was always unexpected or disproportionate to what was happening to her. And I can understand that her performance, compared to all of the other ones, made it seem like her character was the only one who was believable as a human being and not as a, I suppose, person infected by a plant.
Which I suppose makes sense, really, because, I mean, I suppose for much of the film, I think what it's going for is basically Invasion of the Body Snatchers, sort of, Beech Grove Garden edition. Probably agreed that it's worth seeing. It's worth making your own mind up about. I don't think any of us were blown away by it, but I think the standout elements are definitely the production design, how it looks, and the sound design. The sort of the percussion in the music, and then also the sort of like the weird yapping of dogs is really quite unsettling. If you watch the trailer, it predictably leans very heavily on that. That is going to be coming to cinemas on February 21st. I think it's playing at the Filmhouse, but certainly it is out on release shortly, and you can catch it there, and then no doubt it will probably be out on demand reasonably soon after that, I think. But it's definitely coming out, so you can probably see that at least a Filmhouse and hopefully maybe some other cinemas in and around Edinburgh.